Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Sania Asif. Today we will discuss the development of the respiratory system. When the embryo reaches at a 4 week of age, the respiratory diverticulum, which is also known as the lung bud, it will appear as an outgrowth from the ventral wall of the foregut. The appearance and location of the lung bud are dependent upon an increase in the retinoic acid, which is produced by the adjacent mesoderm. The increase in the retinoic acid will cause the upregulation of the transcription factor known as TBX4, which is expressed in the endoderm of the gut tube at the site of the respiratory diverticulum. Now, this transcription factor TBX4 will induce the formation of the bud and the continued growth and differentiation of the lungs. So, we can say the epithelium of the internal lining of the larynx, trachea, and bronchi, as well as that of the lungs, is entirely of endodermal in origin, while the cartilaginous, muscular, and connective tissue components of the trachea and lungs are derived from the splanchnic mesoderm, which surrounds the foregut. This is the diagram showing the respiratory diverticulum arising from the ventral wall of the foregut. In this diagram, also the attachment of the buccopharyngeal membrane, opening of the pharyngeal pouches, and laryngotracheal orifice is shown. In this diagram, you can see here the respiratory diverticulum with the blue. Initially, there is a free communication between the respiratory diverticulum and the foregut, but when the diverticulum expands caudally, there is the development of two longitudinal ridges, which are known as the tracheoesophageal ridges. They separate it from the foregut. When these ridges fuse to form the tracheoesophageal septum, then the foregut is divided into a dorsal portion, which is the esophagus, and the ventral portion, the trachea and the lung buds. The respiratory primordium maintains its communication with the pharynx through the laryngeal orifice. Now, in the diagram A, you can see here the tracheoesophageal ridges, but now there is a free communication between the respiratory diverticulum and the foregut. And the diagram B, you can see here these tracheoesophageal ridges are fusing and forming the tracheoesophageal septum. And in the diagram C, you can see there is a complete separation of the foregut into dorsal and the ventral part. Means dorsal part is the esophagus, while ventral is the trachea and the lung buds. And the diagram D, you can see here the laryngeal orifice by which this is the orifice by which the respiratory primordium maintains its communication with the pharynx. Foregut, which is also known as the pharyngeal gut, it extends from the buccopharyngeal membrane to the tracheobronchial diverticulum. The foregut proper lies caudal to the pharyngeal tube and extends as far caudally as the liver outgrowth. This is the diagram showing the larynx and its various cartilages, which are epiglottis, cricoid, arytenoid. In this diagram, you can see here the various pharyngeal arches, pouches, laryngeal orifice. Larynx is mainly endodermal in origin, means its epithelium derived from the endoderm, and the muscles and cartilages are derived from the mesenchyme of the fourth and the sixth arches. As a result of the rapid proliferation of the mesenchyme, the laryngeal orifice changes in appearance from a sagittal slit to a T-shaped opening. And subsequently, when mesenchyme of the two arches transforms into the thyroid, cricoid, and arytenoid cartilages. So, the characteristic adult shape of the laryngeal orifice can be recognized. At about the time that the cartilages are formed, the laryngeal epithelium also proliferates rapidly, resulting in temporary occlusion of the lumen. And the subsequent vacuolization and recanalization produces a pair of lateral recesses, which are known as the laryngeal ventricles. These recesses are bounded by the folds of tissues that differentiate into the false and the true vocal cords. So, initially, the lung bud is in the open communication with the foregut. The respiratory primordium maintains its communication with the pharynx through the laryngeal orifice. As I told you, the larynx mainly develop between the 5th and the 6th weeks. So firstly, there is the development of the three swellings. You can see in this diagram the lingual swelling, epiglottal swellings and the arytenoid swellings. Anterior derivative of the hypobronchial eminence of the fourth arch will form the epiglottis, while the lateral arytenoid swellings from the sixth arch move medially and form T-shaped aperture. In this diagram, you can see here the epiglottis, which is formed from the hyperbronchial eminence and third and fourth arches, while other cartilage is derived from the fourth and the sixth arches. Muscles of the larynx derive from the fourth and sixth arches, and occlusion of the lumen occur at the 7th to 8th week, while the recanalization will occur at the 10th week. During its separation from the foregut, the lung bud forms the trachea and the two lateral outpocketings, the bronchial buds. As you can see in this diagram, the two lateral outpocketings, these are known as the bronchial buds. At the beginning of the 5th week, each of these buds enlarges to form the right and left main bronchi. The right bronchi then forms three secondary bronchi and the left forms the two secondary bronchi. Thus, we can see here that three lobes will be formed on the right side and two on the left. With subsequent growth in caudal and lateral directions, the lung buds expand into the body cavity. The spaces for the lungs, the pericardio-peritoneal canals, are narrow. They lie on each side of the foregut, as you can see in this diagram. Ultimately, the pleuroperitoneal and pleuropericardial folds separate the pericardio-peritoneal canals from the peritoneal and pericardial cavities, and the remaining spaces forms the primitive pleural cavities. The mesoderm, which covers the outside of the lungs, develops into the visceral pleura, while the somatic mesoderm layer covering the body wall from the inside becomes the parietal pleura, and the space between the visceral and the parietal pleura will form the pleural cavity. In this diagram, you can see here the visceral pleura adjacent to the bronchi and parietal pleura covering the body wall, and the space between these two pleura is the pleural cavity. In the 7th week of development, there are 10 tertiary or segmental bronchi have formed, which create the bronchopulmonary segments of the adult lung. In the 6th month, 17 generations of subdivisions have formed. Respiratory bronchioles are also formed. 6 divisions form during postnatal life. The lungs assume a more caudal position so that by the time of the birth, the bifurcation of the trachea is opposite the 4 thoracic vertebrae. In the next lecture, we will discuss the tracheoesophageal fistula and the maturation of the lungs and the remaining clinicals. Thank you.